The backstage buzz at the Mid-South Coliseum was a tangle of sequins, saxophones, and last-minute sound checks. Technicians adjusted lights above the stage. Roadies hurried past with crates of guitars and wireless microphones. A cloud of cigarette smoke drifted toward the ceiling, mingling with the scent of hot grease from the concession stand. Elvis Presley, still in his tour wardrobe of black slacks and a leather jacket, stood alone in the wings, studying a stack of hymnals he'd pulled from his childhood collection. He thumbed through familiar titles: Amazing Grace, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, Where Could I Go But to the Lord? Their pages softened from years of use. He paused at each, recalling Sunday mornings in Tupelo, Mississippi, when he and Gladys sang through swollen eyes, seeking comfort in words as much as in melody. Tonight, though, none of these felt right. His manager, George, materialized beside him, arms folded. "Son, we're 30 minutes out. Orchestra's ready. Crowds lined up. We can't slot a solo guitar hymn into this lineup." He glanced at the hymnals. People paid for the hits. Elvis set the books aside but did not move. His voice was soft, low enough that George had to lean close. "George, I need one song. No lights, no fanfare, just a guitar." George's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's not your style. And the contract—" Elvis cut him off with a measured nod. He did not argue. Instead, he placed a hand on George's shoulder, gaze steady. "I'll do this once, for someone I never met." George looked in the direction of the stage, where a line of spotlights waited. "All right, but make it quick." Minutes later, the roar of 20,000 fans filled the arena. Elvis's last encore ended with a flourish of pyrotechnics. He bowed, waved, and then slipped off stage through a narrow doorway labeled "Private." The lights on the main floor dimmed, replaced by a single red exit sign glowing behind him. A knock sounded at the side of his dressing room. A gray-haired man in a simple suit stood in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes solemn. "Mr. Presley, may I come in?" The stranger's voice crackled like static over a radio. Elvis nodded and closed the door. The man unfolded a yellowed sheet of paper, edges frayed, corners dotted with coffee stains. "My name is Samuel Carter," he began, voice thick with age and grief. "This letter, my son wrote it to you." He spread it on the dressing room table. Elvis leaned forward. Between them, under the glare of a single bulb, lay the letter. "Elvis, you once said God gave you a voice. I'm 12, from Meridian, Mississippi, and I don't know if anyone hears his voice anymore. I'm asking, if you ever meet him, will you be my answer? Matthew Carter." Elvis's throat tightened. He read the lines twice, slowly, as though each word echoed in an empty hall. "Your son?" he whispered, eyes lifting to meet Samuel's. "He died last year. He believed you'd find a way to speak back." Samuel's hand trembled as he tapped the paper's warped surface. "I brought the original, but I need you to give him his answer." Elvis closed his eyes, mind drifting to his own nights by his mother's bedside, watching her fight for breath, asking questions to a heaven that offered none. He opened them, gaze fierce. "He never heard back?" Samuel shook his head. No reply came. "I thought maybe you never saw it." Elvis rose without a word. He crossed to his guitar stand, lifted the black Gibson J200 that gleamed beneath its velvet case, and slipped it from its strap. The dressing room lights seemed too bright. He knelt by the mirror and adjusted the instrument's tuning pegs, humming chords that trembled with memory and regret. Out in the bowels of the Coliseum, a stagehand buzzed to the lighting control. One spotlight, center stage, now. In the massive arena, the automatic facade of showmanship fell away as the single beam cut through smoke and haze. Elvis stepped onto the empty stage, guitar in hand. The hush was instantaneous, uncanny. Moments earlier, thousands had roared for rock and roll. Now, each person held their breath as though waiting for a sacred word. He positioned the guitar against his hip, strummed a gentle chord, and lifted his head. His voice came not in a belt or a falsetto, but as a plain-spoken confession. "Lord, if you're listening, I'm here." He began to sing, not a hit, but a simple hymn rescued from an old church hymnal, one he sang as a boy. "Where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go but to the Lord? Oh, I've tried everything but the Lord." His fingers moved slowly across the frets, each note weighted with intention. He closed his eyes, singing the lines not for the crowd, but for a boy he never met and for a God he still sought to understand. The single spot of light illuminated Elvis's silhouette. No shimmer of sequins, no sleight of stagecraft, just a man on his knees in melody, delivering an answer unspoken for years. Behind the curtain, George stood wide-eyed, aware that the world outside would never fully comprehend the furor he'd ignite by turning an arena into a sanctuary. But Elvis had become both question and answer, and as the final chord faded into the cavernous dark, he knew this solitary moment was worth every roar he'd ever chased. The arena lights thundered to life as Elvis Presley stepped onto the stage of the Mid-South Coliseum, greeted by a tidal wave of applause that rattled both walls and bones. The band launched into the opening chords of Jailhouse Rock, and Elvis moved through each verse with the ease of a man at home in the glow of spotlights and screaming fans. Sequins glittered under the lamps. His voice poured out, rich and confident, a siren's call to every corner of the packed house. Behind him, screens flickered with kaleidoscopes of color. The brass section hit each accent in time with the stomping of boots and the roar of bodies swaying. In the VIP boxes, wealthy patrons raised champagne flutes. Below, the floor was a sea of waving arms and upturned faces, an ocean of devotion. Yet beneath the extravagance, the cavernous hall felt hollow to Elvis, as though he passed through a dream he no longer recognized. He moved through a whirlwind set. Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender. Each song unleashed a fresh storm of adoration, but when the final notes of Can't Help Falling in Love faded, Elvis lingered on the microphone, chest heaving. He let the audience's cries wash over him until the pounding of their hearts matched the beat inside his own ribs. Then, with a single nod to the drummer, he stepped back and raised a gloved hand. The house lights snapped off. Every colored beam that had danced across the stage disappeared. The roar of the crowd died in a sudden hush, a black velvet silence that pressed against every ear. Only one spotlight remained, bright and solitary, casting a narrow circle of white light onto the center of the stage. The microphone stood alone, unobscured. In that beam of illumination, Elvis's leather jacket and tailored slacks seemed too formal for what he was about to do. He took a breath, as if bracing himself against the weight of that quiet. The hush deepened, raw and expectant. Thousands of fans waited, stunned by the abrupt stillness. No one clapped, no one shouted. The only sound was the gentle hum of a single speaker as he adjusted its height. A roadie slipped a plain acoustic guitar into Elvis's waiting hands. No shimmering hardware, no wireless transmitter, just wood and 6 steel strings. Elvis placed the instrument against his chest, fingers hovering over the fretboard. He closed his eyes for a long moment, seeming to listen for something far away. Then, in a voice stripped of swagger, he spoke directly to the hushed assembly. "I'm not here tonight to entertain you. I'm here to share what I've carried in my heart for years. My doubts, my grief, and the faith I lost when my mother died. If you'll bear with me, I want to sing you a hymn I learned as a boy in Tupelo, a song I went back to when I felt I had nowhere else to turn. His tone was calm, yet every word trembled with sincerity. The audience sat unmoving, as if they feared even breathing might break the spell. Elvis's hand found the second fret. His thumb plucked the low E string, and the familiar melody of "Where Could I Go But to the Lord" floated into the hush like a paper boat on still water. No drums, no horns, just his voice, clear and vulnerable, supported by his gentle strumming. Each line carried the ache of his youth and the weight of his mother's absence. Where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go but to the Lord? Where could I go but to the Lord? Oh, I've tried everything but the Lord. As he sang, his shoulders hunched slightly, as though the burden of those words pressed on him. Beads of sweat glistened on his brow, but the effort in his voice came not from physical strain, but from bearing his soul. The audience sat spellbound, faces pale in the single beam of light. Couples leaned toward one another, tears glinting behind mascara. Men in the front row bowed their heads as if in prayer. When the final refrain trailed off into the darkness, Elvis let the silence hang for a count longer than seemed possible. Then he looked up, eyes glistening in the spotlight. "I don't know if I'll ever meet him in his kingdom," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. "But if I do, I want him to see me not as an icon, but as a man who sometimes lost his way, but who sang this truth in his darkest hour." The arena trembled with the raw force of that confession. Then, slowly, like a wave breaking upon the shore, the applause began. It started as a few hesitant claps in the back, swelling into a thunderous ovation that shook the rafters. Yet this was not the ecstatic roar he knew from any other show. It was a collective exhale of relief and recognition, a communion of souls moved by the moment's honesty. As the lights brightened once more, Elvis stood alone in silence for a heartbeat, then offered a slight bow. He strapped on a sequined jacket and transformed back into the king of rock and roll. Yet the truth of that hymn lingered in every pair of eyes, every pounding heart. Above the stage, the screens flickered again to life, but for a moment, no image could match the power of a single voice, a simple guitar, and the courage to sing a hymn in the dark. The next morning, the glow of dawn crept through the curtains of Elvis's hotel suite in downtown Memphis, painting the beige walls with soft amber stripes. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the muted clatter of room service settling plates in the corner. Elvis sat cross-legged on the edge of his bed, a stack of letters spread around him like fallen autumn leaves. Each envelope bore different handwriting, some cramped and shaky, others flowing and precise, but they all shared a candid urgency that cut deeper than any fan letter praising his latest hit. He unfolded one particular envelope with deliberate care. The stationery felt thick under his fingertips, embossed with the emblem of a small-town church in Arkansas. Inside was a typed note, her words underlined in places as though she feared they might be overlooked. "Mr. Presley, I lost my daughter 2 years ago to cancer. I survived, but her voice lives only in my memories. When you sang that hymn last night, you gave me words I couldn't find, the prayers I kept hidden in my heart. I don't need thanks or fame for this. I just needed someone to speak them. Thank you for giving my grief a voice." Elvis pressed the letter against his chest, eyes closed against the weight of its truth. He rose, gathering the rest of the mail into his arms, and moved toward the window. Below, the city stretched in stillness, empty streets waiting for the day's bustle. He glanced at the smudged fingerprints on the window pane, a testament to hands that longed for connection more than applause. His manager's voice crackled through the door's peephole, urgent and irritated. "Elvis, rehearsal starts in an hour." But Elvis did not call back. Instead, he tucked the letters into his jacket and strode purposefully into the hallway, leaving behind the plush confines of celebrity. He descended the service elevator to street level, where a black sedan waited inconspicuously. No flashbulbs, no throng, just a driver who nodded once and opened the rear door. Their destination was not Beale Street or Sun Records, but a modest county hospital on the outskirts of Memphis. In the lobby, staff exchanged curious glances as Elvis walked past, clutching his mail like a lifeline. He did not introduce himself. He carried no guitar, no microphone, only the letters and a determination that felt heavier with each step. Nurses led him through corridors lined with pale blue tile, past wards where the lamplight danced off IV stands and the soft breathing of patients echoed in the hush. No posters heralded his arrival. No one expected the king. They only sensed a quiet presence entering the pediatric wing. In room 7B, a small boy no older than 7 sat propped on pillows, his cheeks hollow from chemotherapy. Tubes wound around his arms like lifelines tethered to distant voices. The boy clutched a radio tuned low, a static whisper between hospital monitors. On its small speaker, the opening chords of a hymn spilled into the room. "Where could I go but to the Lord?" The boy's lips formed the words in a faint, hopeful murmur. Elvis paused just outside the doorway, watching the child's eyes close as he sang, breath melding with the melody. The singer's heart clenched. This was why he had come. He stepped inside, avoiding the nurse's double take, and approached the bed. The boy's voice dropped as he opened his eyes, recognition dawning. "You're him," the child whispered, voice thin but certain. "You sang last night." Elvis knelt, resting a hand on the boy's blanket. "I'm here to listen," he said softly. The nurse hovered uncertainly, but Elvis shook his head. "Just let me stay," he requested. "No cameras." No crowd. She retreated, leaving the two of them in the hush. Elvis reached into his jacket and withdrew the letter he'd read that morning. He held it so the boy could see. "This came for me," he explained. "It says, 'Your real prayers.'" The boy reached out a trembling hand to touch the paper, eyes bright with unshed tears. Elvis sat on the edge of the bed and began to speak, not to sing, but to share. He recited lines he had culled from the morning's letters, prayers for courage, for peace, for a voice when words fail. As he spoke, the boy closed his eyes and nodded, absorbing each phrase like a lifeline cast across a turbulent sea. After a time, Elvis swept the letters into his lap and smiled gently. "Would you like to say one?" he asked. The boy picked a crumpled note from Arkansas and read aloud its final line. "Let my grief be the seed of something beautiful." His voice wavered, but he did not stop. Elvis listened as though the words were a sacred hymn, each syllable echoing in the sterile room until it felt sanctified. When they finished, Elvis stood. He pressed the letters into the boy's hands. "Keep these," he said, "and when you need a voice, read them." In the hallway, the nurse reappeared, her eyes shining with tears she did not wipe away. Elvis exited as quietly as he had arrived. Outside, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the hospital's facade in forgiving warmth. He paused once, looking back at the building's windows, each one a world of private stories. He slid into the sedan, which pulled away without fanfare. Back at Graceland, Elvis returned to the letters strewn across his desk. He laid them in a neat stack, each envelope a promise to those who wrote, "I hear you." In the stillness of the music room, he lifted his guitar, fingers finding the chords of that humble hymn, and practiced in the dim glow until the first notes of evening drifted through the Mississippi sky. No stage lights awaited him, only the silent communion of a voice learning again to listen. Elvis Presley returned to Graceland under the muted glow of late afternoon, the broad driveway empty of limousines and limousine's usual entourage. The hush of the mansion enveloped him as he ascended the steps and paused beneath the portico, adjusting the strap on his guitar case. Inside, the house was quiet. No crew bustling, no radio chatter. He let the grand front doors close behind him with a soft thud and crossed the marble foyer, boots echoing on the floor. In the music room, sheets of handwritten lyrics and scattered hymnals lay atop his baby grand piano. He set his guitar case on the patterned rug, opened it, and withdrew the instrument, a black Gibson J200 with worn frets and a faint scratch above the sound hole. Tonight, he would record, not a new rock and roll track, but the echo of a confession he made beneath a single spotlight. He moved to the thick-walled control booth beyond the glass partition, where vintage tape machines hummed silently in standby. No producers or engineers sat in the booth. He preferred solitude. He placed a reel of blank 2-inch tape on the spools, threaded the heads, and dimmed the overhead light to a soft amber glow. Elvis eased into the leather swivel chair, picked up his acoustic guitar, and tuned the low E by ear. He pressed play on the cassette deck, cueing the scratchy home recording he made for Matthew Carter's father, his confession of faith, penned not in words but carried in the humble chords of "Where could I go but to the Lord?" The faint hiss of the voice recording filled the booth, a boy's clear question about what Elvis had done with God's gift of song. Elvis closed his eyes, breath hitching. He pressed stop, lifted the studio microphone, and adjusted its position to capture the warm resonance of his guitar's spruce top. He cleared his throat softly and remarked into the mic, "For Matthew," before strumming the opening chord. His voice emerged, matured and weathered, intoning the hymn that had become the quiet center of so many hearts. "Where could I go but to the Lord?" He sang each line with deliberate reverence, his fingers arpeggiating gently across the strings. After the second verse, he let the guitar fall silent for a heartbeat and spoke, eyes closed, voice earnest. "I never answered you in words, Matthew. This is my answer, a song I found in the dark, and now carry into the light." He paused, then resumed singing the hymn's final refrain. When the last note faded, he lifted the needle from the tape and set it aside with careful hands. On the next take, he overlaid the studio recording atop the home confession, blending boy and man in duet, Matthew's youthful query layered beneath Elvis's grown resolve. The mixture was haunting, innocence and experience entwined in a single searching melody. Satisfied, Elvis rose from the chair, stretched his shoulders, and returned the reel to its box. He left the tape machines humming softly and stepped into the music room. There, at the piano, he retrieved a fountain pen from a crystal inkwell and opened a pale dove-gray album cover. With deliberate strokes, he inscribed on the inside flap, "To the boy who asked if I had done my part, I'm still trying. Elvis." He closed the cover, sliding it into a protective sleeve. Outside, the cicadas tapped against the garden's magnolia trees, unseen but present. Elvis walked toward the French doors, pausing to gaze at the sun-dappled courtyard where he had once sang to children in wheelchairs, singular moments of grace that eluded headlines but lived on in private corners of his heart. Weeks later, at a modest pressing plant in Nashville, the final mix of Elvis's last album emerged on lacquers. The tracklist flowed from gospel tunes to bluesy ballads, concluding with a live snippet from the Memphis concert's unannounced hymn, a moment of stark confession captured on the house feed and left intact. "Where could I go but to the Lord? Oh, I've tried everything but the Lord." The plant managers urged him to remove it. "It's not the sound you're known for," they said. "It'll confuse the listeners." But Elvis stood firm. This was not a concession track, not a novelty. It was the album's fulcrum, its final act of honesty. When the album hit record stores, fans expected sequined glory and rock riffs. Instead, their turntables spun a closing hymn and a man's whispered vow. Retailers hesitated, puzzled by its quiet power. Critics dismissed it at first, but a slow tremor grew. Letters arrived from veterans' hospitals, shelters, churches, and solitary rooms across the country. None asked for applause. They asked gratitude. You sang what I dared not say. Your music reached the corners of my soul. Thank you for answering my prayer. 3 years later, scholars unearthed the original letter from Matthew Carter. It found its home in a small museum exhibit dedicated to American music's civil rights era. Its author anonymous, his question preserved beside a photograph of Elvis alone beneath a single lamp. Visitors paused before it, reading, "What did you do in return for the voice God gave you?" Beneath the display, a plaque bore only Elvis's own words, "I'm still trying." In the emptiness of a backstage dressing room, mirrors framed in tarnished bulbs, a solitary white guitar pick on the countertop, stood that same letter taped to the glass with yellow ribbon. No red carpet, no final curtain, just a silent testament to the vulnerability of a man who laid down his crown to speak as a son seeking grace, and found, at last, that the truest music begins where words dare not tread.